The story of museums, it's a bit of a déjà vu because Professor Lewis has brilliantly shown us some of the steps that museums took in their early days, and as a result, I'll try to be as quick on those as I can. The thing that strikes me when I thought about this was, and Roger hit on that very briefly in his introduction, is what little time actually intercedes between these two images. It really isn't very long. What is interesting also is that the museum is, in fact, a very recent invention. In other words, if you compare it with libraries and other institutions that have been around for over 1,000 years, it is really the latecomer and the one about which we have a clear idea of, and that's clearly also been shown today. We're still working on chewing on this issue about what the museum is, what it should be, and what it does. There was no doubt in the minds of the Malatestas when they created this extraordinary institution in the 15th century that theirs was going to be a communal library. It is, in fact, probably the first communal library or civic library open to the public in Europe, and designed by a pupil of Leon Battista Alberti, as you can probably identify, but this beautifully sort of rational and even spacing and so forth. And it is still used today as it was in the 15th century. In other words, people go and read books or take books out and study them and so forth. That's what libraries do still today, and they did it even maybe 1,000 years before Leon Battista Alberti, before this library. And there are libraries I don't know anything too much about in the classical period, but they certainly probably were not that different. Another institution that we have really very little issue about are hospitals. This is what you're looking at there is now a restored and somewhat altered view of the Sacred Infirmary in Malta. The Malta order began in Jerusalem in the year 1000, and their task was to care for pilgrims, and then when they were then later kicked out of Jerusalem, they went to Rhodes. They again established another hospital there. That's disappeared, but the one that they eventually built in Malta is still there. It is no longer a hospital, but in its day, in the 16th century, it was renowned as probably the most efficient and best care that they gave to even indigent patients, to whom they served their meals in silver plates, and that is a legendary activity of the Order of Malta that is still, in fact, active in humanitarian work. Again, a hospital that existed 500, 600 years ago is today, we would not really argue what do hospitals do, what should they look like, what is their mission. Universities, I think, are equally well established as the concept of a university. What you're seeing here is the famous anatomical theater in Bologna, Bologna being arguably the oldest university in Europe. Bologna docet, the Bolognese are very proud. You also get to see this extraordinary building, which actually has been rebuilt after it was bombed during the last war. But what is important here is that the function of the university, in this case of a medical operating room, is still pretty much the same today. The next few, let's say, views of very well-known museums were actually born, as we know, as great private collections, the Uffizi being perhaps the most famous. The building itself was was designed by Vasari and finished by Bontalenti, and it really was, as the name implies, was really a ministry for the developing Florentine Tuscan bureaucracy. It was much later that it was turned into a museum, even though works of art were there. And it was by virtue of the Electress of Saxony. She was the last Medici heir who inherited everything in the 18th century, that it was bequeathed to the city. Were not for her perseverance, all of the Uffizi, all of the Medici art collections would now be somewhere in Düsseldorf or somewhere in Germany, because the Germans were after her to leave everything, as she should have probably done, to her German family. She refused to do that. She put up with a lot of pressure, and in the end, she won out. So we have a woman to thank for, a woman that is somewhat obscure and for which I don't think there's anywhere in Florence even a statue or any recollection of, which is sort of sad. The Vatican and the Church were pioneers in the creation of public collections. This is, it may not be surprising to some of you, but generally one does not think of the Vatican, the Church being involved in art, and above all, classical art, because, of course, in Rome, the various cardinals, various potentates there had amassed gigantic collections of classical art. All you needed to do was dig a hole in the ground. And so these works of art were recognized, of course, very early on as being works of art, and then they were little by little arranged in buildings, as in the case of the Capitoline Museum, in buildings specifically designed to house them. So the Capitol Museum was really began and was open to the public in 1734, which is, in terms of the history of the museums, fairly early. We've seen this before in Professor Lewis's talk. I think he very ably explained exactly how this concept of a private collection being exhibited in a public space, because by this time the Belvedere had become a public gallery with the Habsburg collection arranged, as you see, very carefully, typologically and chronologically in the halls of the Belvedere Palace. The Belvedere Palace was actually built for Prince Eugen, who was a great hero of the empire. It was given to him as a country villa. He had an equally large city house, and having no children, the properties were inherited by his sister, and then eventually Maria Teresa bought them and then turned the Belvedere into a public gallery. Before doing that, she gave a reception for the betrothal of her daughter to Louis XVI, or to the future Louis XVI, to the Dauphin, at which they invited 16,000 people. So that was a good wedding. That was a good party. This is another example of papal illumination, enlightenment. It is a combination of two collections and two efforts, above all with the addition of a great other collection of course, classical art, But this building, or at least parts of it, were actually, unlike the Belvedere, unlike the Capitoline, unlike the Uffizi, parts of this building were actually purpose-built to house the papal collection. And it is still essentially the same and essentially arranged pretty much the way it was in the 18th century. The Grand Galerie is another classical example of an early nationalization of a private collection, in this case, the Royal Collections of France, that were arranged in the Louvre. They were arranged there at the end of the Revolution in 1793. Vivant Denon was the first director, and of course the French, the Napoleon, I would say the booty that he got here and there in the rest of Europe, little by little found its way to the Grand Galerie, and it was of course used as a symbol of the power of the empire. And here he is, in fact, I think, marrying the daughter of the Emperor of Austria. So it was essentially a state event. It was a museum, of course. It was open to the public. It was the Galerie Nationale, became the Galerie Musée Napoléon. But it was a state institution in every way. Surprisingly, one of the very, very first private, museums designed specifically to be a museum is the Prado. The design, the idea of creating it, it dates to 1785. Charles III was the he begot the idea essentially for a natural history collection. Then the Napoleonic Wars interrupted the project. It was not taken up until Ferdinand VII, and at that point it became a fine arts museum in order to house the collections of the royal family. So the Prado, oddly, you wouldn't perhaps think of it, but it is in fact one of the very, very earliest public galleries built as a museum. And as you see by the plans, you will see in the next couple of plans that the arrangement, the idea is there's a similarity. In other words, there is a grand entrance, there is a grand approach, and then there are halls that follow one upon the other in a kind of a rather grand procession. And that is a theme that is repeated. And by then, already by the beginning of the 19th century, the idea of the concept of the museum has taken hold in Europe and is then brought forward, as we have seen also in Professor Lewis's talk, in Germany. I would say probably historically Germany is where the concept of the modern museum really had its full flowering, also because in Germany they were in the process of unifying, of getting things back after the Napoleonic Wars, so there was a real sense that there was something to be done in Germany. It had to be rebuilt, it had to have a national identity, and it had to have an ethos, as it were, that reflected the German nation. One of the, let's say, the philosophical principles on which German museums developed was that of von Humboldt. Humboldt was probably the most famous thinker and famous person in Germany and maybe in Europe because of his travels mostly. but also because he had a vision of the nobility of man and how man could be could rise above his lower instinct and so forth. So it was a very, very strong sense that the museum was a way for mankind to ascend to, and of course the temple-like idea was very much central to that, because it was a sacredness of the art that would help then man to rise and to perfect himself. So here we are again in Germany. The dates again are very early in the 19th century for this project, which was designed to house the collections of the Wittelsbach family. Again, as a gesture to create a center and a core, cultural core for the betterment of the society for which the ruling family, of course, was responsible. But it entailed gigantic expenses and enormous efforts. And of course the collections were great, and they are still visible today, pretty much in the same buildings. But again, here you have this idea of a central core with rooms going out, and as a kind of a development in chronological, artistic fashion. We've seen that also. This is now Berlin, and an arrangement there, which is interesting, of the various schools and the various artists and so forth, in a building that is truly a temple. I mean, this was built sort of between 1820, 1850, 1830, designed by Schinkel. And Schinkel was very much in contact with Humboldt. Schinkel was very well known elsewhere in Europe. The National Gallery is again similar, because here these plans really resemble each other, except that the National Gallery was not the making public of a private collection, but is in a way the first example of a community coming together to create a public gallery, because it was formed with the first core of the National Gallery was about 30 or 40 pictures that belonged to a man called Angerstein. They were purchased in 1824, and then the collection grew, of course, very quickly after that, but mostly by specific gifts of private citizens. So in that sense, in a way, it foreshadows what most museums have now become. The final chapter of the story of the short story of the museum, as it developed in the various stops that we've seen along the way, is the Kunsthistorisches. This comes rather late in the 19th century. The planning started in 1870, and it was completed in 1890. It was designed by a man called Gottfried Semper. And I cannot imagine anything in a way more specific to what this institution does. It welcomes you in a very grand way in its extraordinary domed central hall, and the visitor is somehow a very guided almost by the building. This, in my view, is the sort of supreme example of the classic museum. It just doesn't get any better than this, also because the amount of the expenditure to create this building must have been just gigantic, because it is just all marble and gold and gilt bronze, and it just goes on and on and on. It's a fantastic building. Semper also designed the Dresden Opera House, which is probably, in the same sense, the ultimate sort of classical opera house. So now we're now in the 20th century very quickly, and as you see, in a brief span of sort of 50 years, the entire concept of the museum has changed, the physical concept. In other words, where the visitor goes and how he goes. The Guggenheim, you see, has no central core. It has no particular, let's say, focus in its design. This is, to me, kind of the ultimate confusion. Because we're looking at something that could be a state prison, it could be an insane asylum. Those of you who've been there, you know. I mean, you get there and you really don't know where you are. I mean, they have signs, and if it's raining, you need an umbrella to go from one side to another. The story ends with the Milwaukee Museum, which looks like a kind of a bird flying over the lake, and that's all it does, because those of you who've been there, it's millions of cubic feet of empty space. So it is just a statement about the architect and the building as an object and as a destination, because that's why Bilbao is so successful. People go to see the building. So it is a very short history, the history of the museum, and this is the reason why this conversation today was so interesting, because we really are not sure what the next chapter will bring. Thank you. Yes, sir.
We hear about the traditional museum is that it is a relic of an authoritarian palace, that it's an 18th century conception. If the museum had come together at a different period, it might not have looked like a palace, or is the layout? It was very conspicuous in your images, the enfilade, this gracious logical sequence of room unfolding to another in a hierarchical relationship, works very well for a museum. Could there have been another kind of museum if they hadn't come out of these palaces?
That's a provocative question. It's hard to imagine how else can you really exhibit and enjoy works of art? I mean, if they're paintings, they have to be hung on walls. At the Denver Museum, the one that you saw, which I like to call sort of like a rocket ship, okay? That's a new thing done by Libeskind. There are not even any perpendicular walls there, so you couldn't even hang a picture on if you wanted. I don't know. In other words, we can think of the Wunderkammer. We know what those look like. They were simply full of different objects in shelves and in vitrines and things. So it might have developed as a kind of a storeroom, like a big hangar, where things are just put in, like a treasury. I don't know, but as far as I can see, the palace was, even as a private residence, was in a it was a sort of museum. I mean, people would parade through the rooms and be instructed and edified by what they saw. So that's why it's interesting to imagine what the museum could become. But we'll find out, I'm sure, in short order.
Marco, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.